The Emperor is perhaps the most complex character in fiction, on a level far beyond even that of Leto Atreides, the Great Worm from the Dune saga. The Emperor is a galactic mind like none other. In part 1 of this series, we explored how the lore has changed over the years, looking at the conception and birth of the Master of Mankind through the ages of darkness and strife, as well as the horrific conquest of Terra, known as the Unification Wars. And we ended with the Emperor's great crusade to conquer the galaxy and establish the Imperium of Man. So we're going to pick up where we left off, or actually a little before that, and backtrack to the Council of Nikaea, because it was at this council, which was more or less the trial of Magnus the Red, that the roots of the Imperium's demise began to take hold. Just as the Great Crusade was winding down and the legions of the Adeptus Astartes and their Primarch generals were finishing up with the absolute subjugation and conquest of the galaxy, as the Great Crusade chewed through the galaxy, world after world they encountered happened to be under the control of chaos. But the Emperor had not yet revealed the power of chaos to his sons, or anyone in the Imperium, as it was still a heavily guarded secret, known only to the Emperor, Malcador, and Constantine Valdor apparently. Correct me in the comments if I'm misremembering this. Oh yeah, and the Emperor had warned his Primarch son, Magnus the Red, who was a sorcerer already succumbing to the powers and corrupting influence of chaos. Either way, it is known to less than a handful of people outside of the Emperor. So the legions keep coming across foes that are wielding sorcery, and they come to realize that this is derived from the powers of the warp. But the Emperor knows that mankind is not yet ready to wield the powers of the warp. Man was not yet physically, psychically, or spiritually ready to resist the temptations of warp entities, and not really able to fully restrain their powers, lacking the strength to fully control them. So, to the Emperor, he knew man was becoming more and more psychic as time went on, and that the people of the Imperium were evolving into something greater, warp-touched humans who were on the verge of awakening to being something more akin to the Eldar. This is why he wanted to shut down the use of psychic powers and forbid them to non-sanctioned psychers and astropaths. And Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard Legion, was pretty butthurt that his brother Magnus the Red and his Legion of the Thousand Sons were constantly using and studying warp-fueled sorcery of the same variety that the legions were encountering across the worlds they were conquering. And the Emperor let Mortarion have his say, more or less. And yeah, the Death Guard Primarch narked on his brother because Mortarion not only smells like feces, but he's a snitch too. And then there's Layman Russ, the Space Wolves Primarch. And Russ had a lot of strong opinions on combat and honor. And to Layman, the Thousand Sons' use of sorcery was something they found very, very dishonorable. Russ was a real smack 'em with a sword in an honorable duel kind of chivalrous, knightly dude. To him, using sorcery like Magnus or deception like Alfarius was cowardly, dishonorable, and beneath the Space Marine legions. Of course, each Primarch had their own opinions on this subject, and each one thought that their worldview, galaxy view, was the end-all be-all way for the Imperium to move forward. So of course Mortarion and Russ, given the opportunity to make their case against sorcery, did so, unknowingly setting Magnus on a path that would ultimately see his legion damned, his soul shattered, and his ascension to demonhood. But his brother's accusations and attacks all led to Magnus pleading his case that knowledge is not evil, it is how you use it that is good or evil. But the Emperor didn't really see it that way, and he knew that certain knowledge, primarily that of chaos, the warp, and the dark gods, could absolutely corrupt. And he knew that whatever price was required for him to have created the Primarchs, well, it was still an unpaid tab. And so for Magnus to go poking around in the warp, using his sorcerer's powers to cause near constant shenanigans, was a risk he wasn't willing to take. And so Magnus was admonished publicly. Basically, he got laughed at and called nerd by his father and many of his brothers. And the Space Marine legions and Imperial Guard were forbidden from practicing sorcery of any kind during this period. So the legions each shut down their librarius, and their psychers were integrated into regular combat roles within their respective legions. Some legions did not comply at all with this, such as the White Scars. And Magnus did leave the Council of Nikaea, having been admonished and openly stating that he would comply fully with his father's edict, that neither he nor his legion of sorcerers would practice the dark arts ever again. But he had his fingers crossed, and he was totally lying. And so, having been expelled from Hogwarts, Magnus was now on the path to damnation. The librarians and Magnus had pled their case as well, and ultimately should have been listened to. But the Emperor was super mad at Magnus for his use of the arcane arts, and realized that as Magnus spoke, and his brothers, as well as the Sisters of Silence, testified against him, that Magnus was using the powers of chaos, even though he didn't fully and completely understand yet what chaos was. He was still the only one of the Primarchs that the Emperor had shared the true nature of the warp with, even if it was a glossed over rudimentary education in it. The Emperor felt like, damn, you're the one I trusted with this, and you messed it up so bad you were literally using sorcery. What the hell, Magnus? So since the Emperor was so pissed at his son, he basically pulled the plug on all sorcery, more or less out of spite. Some of the Primarchs and all of the librarians felt like this was a rash decision, and it was. The Emperor was furious. Magnus had been warned, and it was made very clear to him, and yet he disobeyed. But had he not? Then when the time came and the Webway project was operational, Magnus would have been perhaps the most important being in the Imperium, as it had been Big E's intention that Magnus sit upon the Golden Throne and maintain the Webway. But Luke always rushes off to face Vader before he's ready, trained, or even slightly prepared beyond learning to do front flips. That's just how it goes. Big E should have known this, and he's seen Star Wars. Out of the mess that was the Council of Nikaea, the Space Marine legions may have lost, for the time, their librarians. But the new position of chaplain was created to keep the legionnaires in line with the imperial truth. Within the Wordbearers Legion, they would become horrific, demagogical preachers of the dark gods. And now we are to the Horus Heresy, the single greatest event in Warhammer 40K that happened 10,000 years before Warhammer 40K, but is still so important it dominates everything. And this isn't necessarily for reasons of historical continuity, it's just when the battle lines were ultimately drawn. When humanity was faced with the choice, proceed down a very dark and dangerous path fraught with all sorts of terrors and peril in the hope of holding mankind together, or trying to tear that down and establish a new order where everything you've fought and massacred worlds for actually will mean something, but we'll get to that. People have a lot of takes on the Horus Heresy and hold many beliefs to the point of absolute maniacal tribalism. If you don't believe me, take a look at the comments on a Primarch tier list video. Not just mine, anybody's. And it's no different in the setting, in universe, than it is here in the real world. But this video isn't about that greatest of conflicts that humanity has ever known. It is about the Emperor. So what was Big E doing during this galactic civil war? He's the most powerful man in the universe, and the most powerful psyker that may have ever existed. So why did he just not come out and put his son Horus down when the fighting started? Why didn't the Emperor just make his presence known and set the record straight? Well, the answer is more complicated than he was just on his golden throne working on the Webway. No, it is actually much, much darker than that. And there are hints all throughout the lore that he didn't really care. The Emperor wanted the Primarchs to fight and to wipe each other out as much as possible. There wasn't really much room for his warlords in the future of the Imperium. Or so Horus thought. It does turn out that there is plenty of evidence to suggest that this is not fully true, such as the building of opulent living quarters for the Primarchs in the Imperial Palace. So there is evidence to suggest that perhaps the Emperor wanted certain Primarchs with him after the Great Crusade, ruling the galaxy at his side. But where it is dark and where Horus's paranoia would have kicked into high gear is that Malcador openly stated on more than one occasion the Primarchs were just playing pieces in a game of galactic regicide. The Emperor and Malcador were manipulating the greatest armies of super soldiers ever to exist, simply as a game of chess. I guess when you're playing with that much power, then the consequences of your games have real-world implications. So in the story The Last Council, we get a peek at how this is the case. Malcador sees the Primarchs almost as sons, but the Emperor does not. Still, they deliberately pit the Primarchs against one another, knowing that when the smoke clears, there will be less Space Marines for the Custodes to have to purge like the Thunder Warriors. So yes, Big E was sitting on the Golden Throne working on the Webway, but Malcador was watching over the Imperium for him. And let's not beat around the bush here. Both the Emperor and Malcador are absolute power-drunken psychopaths at this point, and they know it. But they have to approach everything with absolute pragmatism, as they are the ones who may have to make the calls that see trillions of souls die, if it saves mankind as a whole, or even 1,000,000,001 other souls. On the surface, Malcador and the Emperor appear to be villainous, terrible warlords, but everything they do, including the sacrifice of worlds, systems, extincting whole Xenos races and human cultures, is all being done for the ultimate good of mankind. Or so the Emperor believes. Or at least, says he believes. Neoth, the new man, having conquered the galaxy and having pitted the conquering armies against one another, remember that bargain he made with the Chaos Gods? Was finally ruling over the enormous empire he'd taken tens of thousands of years to unify. But the powers of chaos heaped so many gifts upon the traitors that they ultimately were able to challenge the throne. And for such a prescient mind, the Emperor really must have been naive if he thought that legions like the World Eaters and the Death Guard were still loyal. And even my favorite legion, the Alpha Legion, turned on him, or did they? And when the dust settled, the Imperium's forces were reduced dramatically, losing almost the entirety of the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamander's legions, as well as the Primarchs Vulcan and Ferrus Manus. Fully half the legion sided with Horus, and the traitors were carving up his new empire like a hot knife through butter. Still, the Emperor remains on the throne, working on the Webway. As the galaxy burned, and as trillions of humans perished in the most horrific war imaginable, as brother slew brother, including the Primarchs, the Emperor kept working on the Webway, completely detached from events, trusting in Malcador to run the Imperium in his stead, unaware that things were going so badly. And this is when Magnus openly broke the Edict of Nikaea and sought to communicate to the Emperor that Horus had turned traitor. Magnus the Red used sorcery to breach the wards around the Imperial Palace, blasting a massive hole in the Webway and allowing demons to pour into it from the warp. It was a massive mistake and ruined everything the Emperor had been working on his entire existence, basically in an instant. Big E was so pissed that he didn't even bother hearing what Magnus had to say, really. The Emperor was not believing that his favorite son Horus would ever even think so much as a thought against him. He thought that it was Magnus who had turned to chaos and that Magnus was lying, and dispatched Layman Russ and the Space Wolves Legion to go fetch Magnus and haul him back to Terra to be put in timeout. While the Emperor was dealing with the massive breach and the hordes of demons literally attacking the Mechanicum workers building the Webway, Russ set off for Prospero to go and get Magnus, who he had always treated with disdain as Russ hated sorcery so much. So we see the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as Magnus tried to do the right thing but brought ruin upon the entire galaxy. A lot of people in the community say Magnus did nothing wrong and the Emperor should have warned him about chaos and the warp and what would happen, except that is wrong. The Emperor gave him multiple second chances, warned him repeatedly, and initially Magnus was the only Primarch and the only one other than Malcador and Valdor to be trusted with the truth of chaos. Yes, Magnus knew what he was doing, but took the risk anyway, as the message he was trying to communicate was so dire. It is truly tragic, but Russ didn't go to Prospero doing the Emperor's bidding. Layman Russ was on the way there when Horus gave him new orders. Russ did not yet know that Horus was a traitor, and so still considered him War Master and his commanding officer. So Russ did what Horus said, and Russ went to Prospero to destroy the Space Wolves and kill Magnus. This all ultimately led to the Space Wolves being distracted, Magnus turning to Tzeentch, the rubric of Ahriman and the Legion turning to dust, and the Thousand Suns fleeing into the Eye of Terror to the planet of the Sorcerers. So the galaxy is burning, worlds are being destroyed outright, whole Titan legions are being deployed like it's nothing. The Imperium is in a no-holds-barred, drag-out, bare-knuckle brawl to the death. Lorgar is really who is to blame, ultimately. Lorgar the Primarch, Erebus the first chaplain, and Corpheron the first captain of the Word-Bearers. After the raising of Monarchia, and the humiliation the Emperor and the Ultramarines visited upon the Word-Bearers Legion, they turned their backs on the Emperor. Though Lorgar still considered his father a god, he considered him not worthy of worship, and he and his boys went on a search to see if the old gods of Colchis, their homeworld, were real. And indeed, they very much were, and Lorgar and the Word-Bearers became the first true Chaos Space Marines. But even though the Emperor had totally screwed over the Word-Bearers, he also naively thought they would stay loyal, and were one of the legions he sent to reign Horus in, and one of the legions that betrayed their brothers at Istvan V during the Dropsite Massacre, where, as I mentioned earlier, the Raven Guard were killed nearly to a man, taking over 90% casualties. Vulcan was killed, or thought to have been, and the Salamanders were absolutely butchered. And the Iron Hands got smoked too. Their Primarch Ferrus Manus was beheaded by his brother and best friend. Horus was ready after Istvan. He was ready to press on for Terra, a war that would grind on for years, but eventually the traitors would arrive in the solar system and come to challenge the throne. The major irony is that Horus rebelled because of a vision he received when poisoned by a chaos-tainted blade. And that's the subject of another video, one on the Horus Heresy. But basically, Horus was shown a future where the Emperor erased him and his brothers from history, turned on them, and purged them, and would let go of the imperial truth so that he could ascend to godhood and rule over everything. And this is ironic because it was the vision of the future that came to pass because he rebelled. But Horus misinterpreted this, chaos shenanigans or whatever, and set off to go kill his dad for betraying them all and bringing about the exact future he set off to fight against. But back to Big E, who is still stuck dealing with the Webway disaster, trying to keep Terra from being overrun by demons. He communicates to Malkador and Rogel Dorn that they are to manage the defense of Terra and fighting of the traitors, as he's dealing with a crisis that is pretty much just as big, and he's the only one strong enough to psychically do the job. But the Emperor also communicates with an astropath named Kai Zalane via telepathy, and they had been granted visions of the future and the ultimate fate of the Emperor at the hands of Horus. And the Emperor reveals to Kai that he not only knows what is coming and his ultimate fate, but he accepts it basically as his penance, as the cost of failing humanity. This is where the Emperor shows he's not just a total space tyrant and galactic Joseph Stalin, but has some depth of emotion and love for humanity, if not for any single human, for the entirety of humans. I did say earlier he'd let 1 trillion die to save 1,000,000,001. Let's update that to he'd kill 1 trillion to save 1,000,000,001. But yeah, the Emperor of Mankind knows what is coming for him. He knows the dark future that exists and puts it all on his own shoulders, considering it all a result of his failure. Wow, what a narcissist. But then again, the guy has been lying to everyone about being a god, and I can't imagine what kind of narcissism being a god causes. It must be pretty extreme, honestly. Primarch of the Raven Guard, Corvus Corax, comes to the Imperial Palace to seek an audience with his father, and Corax is turned away. He is not to disturb his father, the Emperor, who is too busy working on the Webway. But the Emperor does something here that is really cool, and he telepathically communicates with Corvus. Since the Raven Guard were slaughtered, and there were only a handful of survivors, the Emperor tells Corvus Corax how to access his laboratories and bypass a ton of secret booby traps and safety protocols, how to actually use the Gene Lab to create new Space Marines. The Raven Guard Primarch was the only Primarch trusted with such insanely secretive knowledge. It didn't bring Corvus completely out of his super depression, but it could have eventually if the Alpha Legion hadn't ruined everything. So, after sitting on the Golden Throne for 5 years, the Emperor was showing signs of exhaustion. His nose was bleeding sometimes, and this even showed in his psychic visions that he'd used to communicate with the Legiones Custodes through the Tribune Ra Endymion. It was at this time that the Emperor sensed the birth of the terrible demon Dracnean in the Warp, the demon who becomes the sword wielded by Abaddon the Despoiler in the future. But yeah, the Emperor realizes the war in the Webway is wrapping up, and he orders the Sisters of Silence to gather up 1,000 Psykers and sacrifice them to the Golden Throne to help power it. Again, he's getting exhausted. So the sacrifice allowed the throne to be powered for a single day, and he used this to physically enter the Webway and rescue the retreating human forces and subdue the demon Dracnian, but only by trapping it and binding it into the body of his tribune, Ra Endymion. The Emperor then ordered this most loyal of servants to run as far and deep into the Webway as he could to keep the demon away from humanity, and then he was forced to shut the Webway portal and get back on the Golden Throne. The Emperor lamented to those in his presence and those he communicated to psychically that with the Webway project in total ruination, the inevitable fate of mankind was ultimately to meet the same doom as the Eldari, to become extinct, slowly destroyed by chaos, and consumed. And the Emperor basically has his first nervous breakdown in an existential crisis. I guess he hit middle age or whatever, but he admits that he doesn't know what to do to save humanity from extinction. For the first time in his unimaginably long life, the Emperor did not know what to do. So ultimately it took 7 years for Horus to reach Terra and challenge the throne world with his massive forces and fleets and the traitor Primarchs as his generals. And the Emperor had to sit on the Golden Throne the entire time. Except for a few moments he could relinquish the responsibility to Malcador the Sigillite. But it was a huge strain, even on the Emperor, so it was way too much for Malcador. Still, he gave his friend and master reprieve on occasion. But the war grinds on, the traitors not able to penetrate the palace's defenses due to some amazing heroics from some total badasses like Sanguinius and Rogel Dorn. But the traitor Primarchs were totally fierce and they were close to victory on the ground. The arch-traitor Horus Lupercal would lower the void shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, in a taunt to the Emperor. He's literally like, let's fight this out ourselves, one-on-one, like when Saddam wanted to box George W. Bush, except the Emperor took Horus up on this offer. Big E gets up off the Golden Throne and leads a strike force to Horus's flagship, teleporting on board with his crew to go finally put down the nonsense shenanigans his favorite son was up to, and also put down his favorite son. This is where the lore was massively changed recently, or perhaps we should say, it was elaborated upon and added to in such a way that it puts pretty much the entirety of what we've known as canon lore for decades into question. And I for one think it's pretty awesome. The old lore, what we have known in the rulebooks since 2nd edition, has changed a bit with each edition. But the End in the Death has given us a lot of new, clearer, or even contradictory depictions of those events. There are some real bangers in here, and the possible threads of future plots they could follow are predictably innumerable. But before we get into the final battle, the End in the Death, I want to address one thing that just, well, it totally sucks. And I mean, it really pisses me off. And that is the battle between Horus and Sanguinius, which we'll get to. But first I have to give a shout out to the old lore on this one. Sanguinius had originally landed a blow on Horus that put a chink in his armor, which the Emperor exploited. So Sanguinius' ultimate sacrifice was completely for a reason. He gave his life to deliver that blow, which ultimately allowed the Emperor to prevail. This is no longer the case, and like I said, we'll get to what it is now, but just had to get that out of the way, as Sanguinius' sacrifice, how and why it happened, has always been one of the most compelling things about the character to me. I mean, what a total badass, unparalleled in every way. Maybe they wanted to reduce some of the luster around the Angel of Death and make him a little less perfect, but I do feel he gets robbed hard by the new lore, and honestly, I am only just now realizing that I need to make this video as a way to deal with that. So I guess this is therapy to talk about it? Okay, moving on then. So the strike force that the Emperor left with for the Vengeful Spirit consisted of Big E, Rogel Dorn and his contingent of Imperial Fists, Sanguinius and a contingent of Blood Angels, and the Custodes. The Emperor felt it was futile, but it was all he had left, and so he went on to the ship, but the teleportation scattered the champions from one another, as the Vengeful Spirit was acting as a massive warp gate at that point, and was a locus for warp energies coming through and dominating the entire solar system. And this effectively meant that when they were scattered on the Vengeful Spirit, they were scattered through the warp, or some aspect of it. Sanguinius was the first to find Horus, and it did not go as it did in the old lore. Sanguinius had been battling all day multiple greater demons of Khorne, including Angron of the World Eaters. The demon Primarch had been dispatched or dealt with by Sanguinius, and he was battered. He was the best duelist of all the Primarchs and was said to have been able to take any of them in a fight. But yet, when he faced Horus, he stood no chance. And not because he was already exhausted and battered, but because Horus was swollen with the power of all four Chaos Gods. They had heaped so many rewards upon him. He was oozing with power. Palpable waves of Empyrean energies wafting off of him, undulating between the warp and real space. Horus was ascended, and well beyond the power of even the Emperor of Mankind. Sanguinius, well, he was a prescient being and had visions of the future. He knew his death at the hands of Horus was imminent, and he went with the strike team aboard the Vengeful Spirit. But he also wanted to change that fate, and so understanding that, because he was doing the exact same thing himself, the Emperor allowed Sanguinius to go. Horus battered Sanguinius to a pulp with the Great Maul Worldbreaker, caved his head in like Gallagher smashing a watermelon, and turned it to goo. Completely desecrating Sanguinius' body, he hung it up in mockery, displaying the mutilated corpse for the Emperor to see, his perfect son destroyed upon his arrival. But getting to Horus was not such an easy task for the Emperor. In that journey through the Vengeful Spirit, the final fight with Horus Lupercal, and the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne are the subjects of the third part of this series,